Dr. Nick Bowman is the Mary Louise Peterson Chair in Higher Education, Professor of Higher Education and Student Affairs, Senior Research Fellow in the Public Policy Center, and Director of the Center for Research on Undergraduate Education at the University of Iowa. His work uses a social psychological lens to explore key issues in higher education, including student success, equity and diversity, undergraduate admissions, and quantitative research methodology. He has written over 100 peer-reviewed journal articles that have appeared in outlets such as Review of Educational Research, Educational Researcher, Sociology of Education, Social, Psychological, and Personality Science, and Science Advances. He is also an author of the third volume of How College Affects Students, which systematically reviewed over 1,800 studies on the short-term and long-term effects of post-secondary education. Dr. Bowman's research has received popular attention through articles in National Public Radio, the New York Times, the New Yorker, The Economist, The Atlantic, the Huffington Post, and other outlets. He has received the Association for the Study of Higher Education's Promising Scholar Early Career Award and the University of Iowa's Scholar of the Year Award. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bowman.
So I have a microphone out here, which I turned on. Can you all hear me? Excellent. I'm going to try to walk around a little bit because that's more interesting than standing behind this the whole time. Thank you so much for having me here. This is actually my first time at the University of Dubuque, and I have a bit of campus envy because you have an absolutely beautiful campus. So I want to talk a little bit about, in order to delve in, as I had conversations about coming here today, the idea of how is it that students respond to setbacks and the importance of that. And so that setback could be, not doing well, in an initial midterm. It could be doing poorly on the paper, and particularly thinking about that early setback. Or maybe I should sleep more because I was enjoying, the beginning of college and all that it has to offer. Also like just the knowing what to expect, from a college level exam or an exam in that particular subject and that particular professor, so on. It also just might be dumb luck. I studied certain things. Those things were on the test a little bit, but actually the test went somewhat in a different direction. And so, So a lot of things could fall into this boat of like thinking, we can do better next time. However, unfortunately, the alternative to this, and there's probably more than one alternative, but thinking that, wow, I did poorly, and then having some sort of doubt. And again, that doubt might be specific to performance in that class. It might be, for that major, for that career that students might want to go into. It might be for college in general, thinking like, well, I don't know that this is really for me. And what's really, really important, and this is really the focus today, because I actually think this is central to growth mindset, is like, how do you respond to those setbacks and thinking about what happened? Because you are going to face some sort of setback, academically, socially, etc. in college. So what do we do about that? So broadly speaking, all of this is just questions around, how do you think about learning and intelligence and beliefs about how much we can improve with appropriate effort and strategies. Is it just sort of like, hey, you're good at something or you're not, or that you really can make a difference, through these different approaches. It's also worth noting, this is sort of I intentionally phrase this very broadly here, because this talks about a variety of different contexts or life domains. So you might believe that, you can improve a lot in, say, academics, with appropriate effort and strategy. But there might be other things that you're like, I don't know so much. So personally, I played the piano for about 10 years before. As a younger person, played a little bit in college. Given how long I played, I was not very good. And I was jealous when I would see other people being like, I don't even need to read music. I'll just play this by ear. And I'm like, So I have a bit of an orientation toward like, there's something about music that for whatever reason, it's not for me. And I can try very hard and do all these certain things, but there's sorts of limits, to what my effort, maybe my strategies were just not bad. And maybe I should have practiced more. But some people really seem to have some intelligence there. And this work is often sort of simplified into like two sets of beliefs, and it really is a continuum. So in that piano example, I certainly believe that like one could get better to some extent with effort and strategies, but a lot of times in these sorts of conversations, we talk about beliefs broadly just because it's easier to have a conversation around them. I also note you all will get a copy of this presentation afterwards, so I've included some hyperlinks on them if you're interested in the references. So this first one here is Carol Dweck's book on mindsets, which some of you may have heard of. They also, I think Carol Dweck and colleagues are the ones who created this website, which is basically a website of resources based on this work that you can access there. And so broadly, these are described, as having a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. Growth is the one that like, hey, there's lots, your basic intelligence can be improved, as well as, things in the academic domain through appropriate, effort and strategy, where fixed mindset, you're like, well, some people are just sort of good at this, others aren't, and that's pretty much how it goes down. And what's really important about these is the sort of consequences of holding these mindsets. And so this is also a link to a nifty figure that's fancier than this, but the font would be way too small on this slide, so I wanted to summarize it here. So broadly speaking, people hold this growth mindset, this belief that, like people, you can improve with effort to strategy. You have a desire to learn, hey, if I play the piano more, I'm going to get better at it, and I might actually get really good at it. And so as a result of this, I'm going to embrace challenge, so I might see, you might have something that's more difficult, whether we're talking about playing the piano or we're talking about something in academic or career domain. But hey, I know that I can overcome it. I'm going to get better as a result. So I embrace those challenges. And when I do, and it's a matter of when, not if, I hit some sort of obstacle or setback, or particularly performing less well in college than in high school, like I'm going to persist in the face of those obstacles because I know that there's a lot of things I can do to succeed. And as a result, like effort is the path to excellence. Like I'm not going to know all this stuff in all of my exams without going to class, without doing the readings, without doing the required assignments. This is the way that you get toward mastery of that material. What's really important, and for many of you here, perhaps all of us here, who spend a lot of time providing feedback in student assignments, that this is a way of learning. This is, in the context of college, like instructors telling you, hey, this is what you want to do better in order to improve next time. This is a really valuable source of information. It's also worth noting as well, like if you see other people who are successful, this is a great example of a role model that you want to emulate. You're like, hey, someone else did well, and that might be someone that you see as like a, kind of a popular figure in media or whatever the case may be, as a celebrity, or it could be someone, who's more local, some other student who has an inspiring story that's been successful with this. And overall, as a result of all of these things, and perpetuating these over and over, you're going to get higher levels of achievement. So then on the other side, there's a fixed mindset. Sorry, I'm standing so you can all see me. And so there's a kind of different orientation toward this. So instead of like, this idea of like, hey, I'm looking to learn, I'm looking to look smart. And that looking smart isn't just so that others think you're smart, it's at least as much so that you yourself think you're smart. So if something like intelligence or academic ability is something you really value, and you either sort of have it or you don't, you want to think you're smart. And so that's your overriding goal. And that's how you can approach a whole bunch of different things. So if something's really challenging and you might not do well, you want to avoid that because then you might not be as good at this as you otherwise would hope. You face that setback or obstacle, and you're like, well, I guess I don't have it. I'm going to go ahead and step back, because if I keep going and doing this, this might look bad. As a result of all of this, if it really is this fixed, thing of like whether academic ability or piano playing skill or whatever the case may be, like effort isn't all that useful. It certainly isn't as useful. Again, these are sort of like, continua on the extreme here. It's also important as well that you might see feedback as threatening, that you see this and you're like, oh, well, here I got this negative feedback. This person doesn't think I'm very good. A, I might not want to look at it at all. Or B, I might see it as like, well, this isn't really this faculty member. They don't know what they're talking about. Like, this isn't really pertinent, to my improvement. It's also, I think this one is particularly important, because instead of being excited that your friend did really well in that same class as you, and being excited for them. Maybe they're smarter than me. Maybe they're better at this career that I really want to enter into than me. And this is really threatening, as opposed to being excited for others. Again, the social comparison becomes really important. And of course, as you can imagine, if this happens over and over and over again, and people still continue to hold this fixed mindset, say in this context about relevant academic domains, they see it as achieving less than their potential overall. So I'm actually not a huge golf fan. I'm a huge sports fan. So I do want to, just take an opportunity to talk about one particular example that I'm an academic, and so I watch TV. I'm like, ooh, growth mindset example. So Colin Morikawa is a golfer in the PGA. He was actually coming in. He won the Open Championship, aka the British Open, about a month ago. I think he's like 23 years old, really young guy, was actually 4th ranked in the entire world coming into that. And as a result of winning, he became 3rd ranked. So you could easily imagine that someone like that is like, they're on top of things. And so they're like, whatever I'm doing, that's working. I've got my golf skills. I know what's happening, the end. But apparently, Colin Morikawa is really he goes around to all of these, longtime veterans, who, by the way, he's ranked much better and is arguably much better at golf than, but he's constantly seeking feedback from them about different ways to go. So a while back, I guess there are different ways to hold a putter, apparently. And so one of them, there's a different grip, and he tried this new grip, and it was working really well for him. It's supposedly more accurate, when you're trying to get the ball in the right direction. So, after talking to a bunch of people, he incorporated it, it worked well for him, and this was great. But then he went to the British Open, and apparently the grass is a bit different in terms of, how the greens are, the length of the grass, et cetera, et cetera. So this grip that he had before, when he's trying to putt the ball, twice as far as that back door over there, it didn't work very well. He didn't have a strong enough grip on the ball in order to putt that. And so he decided, again, he's constantly looking to improve, and he's like, hey, for this particular setting, if I need to hit a long putt, I'm going to go back to my original grip, where I have a stronger grip on the club. I'm going to hit it that way. And sure enough, he did about as well as anyone putting in that particular tournament, and he won. But this is an example of him constantly trying to get better, even though he could very easily be like, what I've got going for me is working. Why am I going to seek advice from other people who aren't playing nearly as well as I am? But he's constantly seeing, what can he do, both in terms of effort and strategies. And I think most people, who are at that level of golf, they practice lots and lots and lots and lots, but he's constantly trying to see, well, how do I do better? So an important issue when we think about this in college context is who actually holds these different mindsets. And it's important that there isn't a single, there might be somewhat different, relationships. And again, this is somewhat of a continuum, but that you can't just be like, oh, this is the type of person that holds a fixed mindset, or this is the type of person that holds a growth mindset. And this becomes really important when you think about, because I think it's very easy to be like, oh, if we think about, our students who have come in with lower levels of high school, preparation, achievement, and so forth, that maybe these are the people we're more worried, we would think that they hold a fixed mindset. But it's actually really risky for those folks who did pretty darn well in high school, didn't face a lot of obstacles, and now they come to college, they're going towards this degree. I understand you'll have a lot of accredited programs, so those standards of those programs are separate from, what perhaps as you all as individual instructors, might do separately. And so for the first time they face challenge, when they're, in college. And this could be very threatening as well, because all of a sudden, they're in this new environment, they get this early feedback, particularly if it's early, that maybe they're not going to be as successful as others, and maybe they're not as good as they thought they were. All of a sudden, all this confidence that they had before, which is really just I'm good at school and I'm good at all these academic things. Now all of a sudden, this is being threatened. It's also important to talk about how these mindsets are developed and changed over time. So, and this is the role, moving in the direction of where we're going, is that people who you care about, whether that meaningful others are parents, instructors, advisors, et cetera, can promote or hinder these growth mindsets. This is particularly important at transition points. And so this is why I'm using this example of, students entering college and having early college, because this is where you can really change students' mindsets for the better or the worse. Unfortunately, it can go in either direction. It's also important to note that environment, broadly defined, can send very powerful messages about, whether we expect students to succeed, as a result of hard work, effort, and strategies, or whether we're just trying to separate people out. This is one that really, really bugs me. And it's also, as we think about, the extent to it, like how do people develop fixed mindsets in the first place? I've heard many college faculty say things like, I'm not a math person, and it's okay. And then you see other people that are like, oh, yeah, they smile and nod, like, I'm not a math person either. And it's like, this is such a strong fixed mindset message. Like, it's even phrased in identity language, like, I'm not a math person. Like, that doesn't imply that, like, if I worked harder at math, it could work. People sort of distance it, like, I'm not a math person, it's okay. It's like, well, if you hold that, you've just, like, cut off, this large chunk of potential majors and career options if you're like, hey, I just don't do math. So you can see how, like, hazardous this is, how darn pervasive, this sort of language is. What's also really important as we think about this from an equity lens is that there are a lot of stereotypes, and often within STEM fields, but certainly not exclusive to STEM fields, about the performance of certain groups, whether those are women in STEM, whether those are racially minoritized students. And those by definition are fixed stereotypes. It's not, there's no stereotype that, oh, this group of people, they're going to struggle, but with appropriate strategy, they might, no. It's basically like there's some people who are cut out to do this stuff, and they're not. This whole identity group, this whole group of people, they're less cut out for it than others. And so this is actually one of the reasons why a very consistent finding in this research is that efforts to promote growth mindset and others of these malleable mindsets are more effective for students who hold minoritized identities, because unfortunately they're the ones who face these negative stereotypes, that sometimes are made very explicit, sometimes implicit. And so this is where we all come in. I still remember, as an undergraduate, and I hear some of this anecdotally today, I had come back, like my people I knew who were interested in, being like, some sort of STEM major or doctor, they went into their first day of class and they're like, these are basically verbatim quotes that they heard, not everyone's cut out for this. The whole point of this class is not for you to learn anything, but for us to distinguish the people who really deserve to be doctors from those who don't. That is some darn strong, explicit fixed mindset messaging if I've ever heard it. And again, I would argue, it's hard to get like exact data on this, but I'd argue that this sort of thing goes on a lot even today. There's also ways that even if you don't say it this explicitly, what sort of messages are you sending through your syllabi and the way in which your syllabi are structured, opportunities for feedback and resources. Also one of my interests that is a little less, in the domain of instruction, but more actually as we think about advising and think about university policies, idea around academic probation. Because you can imagine students could interpret this in a couple of different ways. A sort of growth mindset interpretation might be something like, oh, wow, like, I really need to do better. Here are these people, I've got these resources that can help me, et cetera, et cetera. That's, that would be a great interpretation if students receive that. Unfortunately, and sometimes the result of colleges and universities' own messaging and framing and so forth, and also just if that's a threatening situation, like, hey, you're going to be out of school if you don't improve your GPA, perhaps by next semester. And the sorts of fixed mind, maybe students that are like, well, maybe this isn't for me. Look, the university doesn't even think I can necessarily do it. Why should I believe that I can do it? I've intentionally not put like lots of random citations and studies in this, just for like the usability one. But this is one that's done by some of my colleagues, and I'm going to share some of their resources that they have a bit later on. But so they did a study of about 150 faculty and 15,000 students across a whole variety of contexts. And so they found it. So they surveyed faculty. They got, to what extent were their mindset fixed versus growth. And then they did a bunch of surveys with students and also looked at their performance, et cetera, et cetera. So it turns out no one is motivated by a fixed mindset, consistent with all that stuff earlier. Why would you be if faculty are just saying, hey, we're separating the people who are good from the people who aren't good? Why would you be excited to do anything? Given that some groups, particularly racially minoritized students, are the target of some of these, stereotypes around fixed mindset, it was about if you sort of separated it into two groups of relatively fixed versus relatively growth. It was actually double the size of racial performance gaps with the fixed mindset faculty versus the growth mindset faculty. This even when accounting for the fact that some of these are different fields of study, and so on and so forth. So it's really important, again, for all of our students and for equity to think about this. So I pulled some of your statistics on this because I was interested in your retention and graduation rate. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this College Navigator resource, but it's really cool. There's, as a part of the reporting to the federal government, you put all sorts of statistics. I put the date up there of when I did this last month because every year they update it with new statistics, and I actually don't know whether they've updated it today or if you look a month from now, what exactly those stats are. And so two of the stats that get put up a lot and get talked about a lot at many institutions is how many of your students come back and follow your second year, and how many come back in 6 years. The stats, I'm sorry, not come back, but graduate. So they're done coming because they satisfied all the requirements that are going on for things. I also going to go show stats for full-time students. This is just the way the federal government reports these things. It's looking at full-time because they're more likely, to graduate within a certain time period. And so the stat there is 65% of students coming who are returning for their second year and 46% graduating. If you sort of flip that over of how many students are dropping out, so another way to say that is that just over a third of students aren't returning for their second year, and just over half are not receiving graduating degree. There's a bunch of limitations to these stats. One of them is that that students might stop out and then come back and graduate, and so it's a little misleading to compare these directly. And also, none of this accounts for transfer. So this is only students who start at a particular institution and graduate from that institution, which by definition, there might be lots of students who ultimately do receive a 4-year degree over a 6-year period, but just not necessarily from the University of Dubuque. So another way to do this is to sort of see well, what's the difference here? And I would actually argue this difference between the retention and graduation is pretty small. That less than 20 percentage point, suggesting that, students who were, again, this is slightly misleading to say it this way, but of students, who are stopping, who leave after that, it's not a whole huge chunk more that eventually don't graduate. So it really seems like, students make it to that second year at this institution, they're quite likely to graduate, which is interesting. That sort of combination of statistics is an interesting one. It really shows the potential, for thinking about what happens in the first year and the potential for that to really move graduation rates. So how exactly do we do all this stuff and to use growth mindset to leverage it? So one thing, you might have known I use effort and strategies a lot. You could argue that feedback is kind of a subset of strategies. That's a thing to do, to look at feedback. But within, some of the discussion around growth mindset, hopefully, again, that you're all providing that feedback, to really sort of lead with that is a very important piece of strategy that gets underutilized a lot of time. It's a lot of times people talk about, oh, here we have, writing center, or tutoring, or supplemental instruction, or whatever the case may be. But that feedback that instructors give is really important. And this is something that you can emphasize in a lot of different ways and in different contexts. Another really important one, and arguably a lot of the work, the social psychological work on this topic, boils down to how do you normalize academic challenges and setbacks? And one way to do this, as someone who students might look up to is, someone who's sort of a model and they're the instructor of this, is to show that this happened to yourself. So as one example of that for me personally, so I was fortunate enough to do well in high school. I come to college, I was in the quarter system in college, and the first 2 quarters I had worse grades than ever received before in any semester ever, before then. And it turns out, because I learned from that, those were by far the worst grades I received throughout my 4 years of undergraduate education. And that was hard, and I had some questions around that. As moving to the graduate school, I also wanted to publish things and all of this. And the first time I submitted something to a journal, they literally sat on it for 2 years, 2 years. And then they're like, oh, here's something. And then they gave feedback that seemed to forget that they had a special issue that was what I submitted to. And so that was another time where I'm like, I'm like, wow, maybe this academic thing isn't all it's cut out to be. And so it's really important to think about, that these experiences are things that a lot of people go through. And so you're not the only one, because that's the thing, as you think about fixed mindset, if you think, oh, well, I faced this challenge, I didn't do well, that means it's not for me. Essentially you're offering counterexamples. You're saying, well, actually, a lot of times, people face setbacks, and it turns out well. Another way to go to help with this is to note that your expectations actually are high. You're not doing this to be easy, you're doing it so that they learn the relevant material, and then you're helping students reach them. By the way, this, you may know, this is a verbatim quote from your website, which is a really nice one. It has, it's like kind of like, I don't remember what page it is, but there's kind of like several like student examples that come up. And so one of them is exactly this. And this is the student describing what happens here at the University of Dubuque. So that's pretty cool. There's also a lot of different ways, and I'll give you some resources here in a couple of minutes about how to do this. But there are many communications that you can tailor. And the important thing about this is you could actually think of them as two related but separate processes. One is to remove fixed mindset framing, and the other is to incorporate growth mindset framing. So we had these examples of people just saying, this course separates the good from the bad students. One way to go, the easy way to go is, okay, let's not say that. But then how do you actively incorporate messages of growth mindset, in this, whether it's in class, talking about, the use of resources, talking about, learning from previous exams and so forth. How do you do syllabi? How do you send emails that are, I was working recently in a dissertation with a student on a student, was actually testing, was randomly assigning students, who received a low grade on their exam in, I think this was a business class. And so, going, and so randomly half of them got an email, randomly half of them didn't. And then, unfortunately, I wasn't involved in the writing of the email. And the way the email was phrased was basically like, this is your grade. Mathematically, you are still able to improve, but I'm slightly exaggerating for effect, but mathematically, you're able to improve by getting higher grades on future assignments. And I was like, this was such a great opportunity to talk about, hey, I'm really concerned, to offer, this sort of empathy, hey, I'm here for you. I've seen lots of people in your situation who do quite well at the end of, the exam. Please let me know if you ever want to talk. You can really engage people in a meaningful way that's not just like, this is a math formula. So it's not only the reaching out, actively, which, the student's idea was that would be helpful, but also how do you do that in a way that conveys a growth mindset and conveys, both concern and optimism, for that student's future success. Again, the academic standing stuff is somewhat of a pet interest of mine, and I think it's a little maybe outside of the scope of this conference, but it's another domain to think about really usefully. There's also, you may or may not see this or hear this a lot, but sometimes students might convey, in their conversation, just say something that's just like, oh, this isn't for me, and then be like, oh, why do you say that? And maybe it's because they find it really super boring, in which case, like any growth mindset conversation, if they really don't want to do it, they don't want to do it. But if it's not for me because they feel like I faced this setback, in this particular exam or this paper, or whatever the case may be, then we can have a conversation around it. And then one of the most productive ways to do that is actually to engage directly with students, because you could just say, no, you can do it. And then they may or may not believe you. But, how do you do that? To ask them like, hey, why do you say that? Oh, I didn't do well. Well, let's talk. What did you do to study for this exam? How did you prepare for it? And probably in that conversation, you may find that they're not studying the right things. They're not studying enough. They're not using their resources. They may not even be coming to class, et cetera, et cetera. There's an opportunity for you to sort of model growth mindset thinking, as opposed to just saying, hey, have a growth mindset. By, having this conversation to be like, hey, some students really find this resource to be particularly helpful. Or, hey, I provided some good feedback, I think you've got some great potential here. And so how do you get them in a conversation to improve? Because that way, the student gets invested as a result of this. So one thing around, or I guess it's actually going to be three things, is I think it's important to head off the past. When people think about growth mindset, there's some things that people think that are not accurate. And so it's important to address those as well. One of them is it's all about effort. You didn't do well enough, you need to study more. You still didn't do well enough, study some more. And it's important because some students don't do well because they're putting all kinds of time in it, and either they're not doing it in an effective manner, or, and that effect, I guess a subset of that would be that ineffective manner could be like, oh, I'm sort of sitting out and I'm chatting with someone and I'm online and blah, blah, blah. So they could be like, hey, my study time was like a zillion hours, but how much are they investing? And are they investing in the right thing? Are they just sitting there trying to memorize a whole bunch of facts? So they are trying to understand how concepts fit together, effectively, which by the way is actually a better way to memorize than memorization. And you have the benefit of learning how things fit together, which, in many contexts is important. And so it's really important as you have these conversations to think about these issues, to talk a lot about strategies, about use of feedback, and so forth. It's also not the case that every student is necessarily well qualified or well prepared or equally so. Our K-12 educational system is highly inequitable in many, many different ways. So there are absolutely students who are entering your classes at different places, given the opportunities that are available or possible for them to access. And so growth mindset doesn't mean that with the same amount of studying, that every student is going to do well. Some students actually have further to go. What a growth mindset perspective is conveying is that this is something that's very doable for them, and with appropriate effort and strategy that they can succeed. It's also not suggesting that low standards are necessary to help facilitate success. If anything, as we're kind of implicit before, the fixed mindset people are the ones who are all excited about low standards because then they can, do well and get the questions right, and then, they look smart to others and themselves, and that's exciting. So we talked about, this idea of, setting high standards and conveying that we can reach them. In fact, growth mindset people, they have this desire, this motivation to actually engage in new challenges when they're conveying an academic standard. So again, you're going to get a copy of this. So I wanted to share some resources that are from some of the social psychologists I work with. And they started this organization called the College Transition Collaborative that's specifically focused on using social psychological approaches to bolster primarily undergraduate student success. And so just about a month ago, so I'm excited to be able to share these now, they came up with a library of resources through the student experience project that they're holding. And so there's a whole bunch of tools there, not all of which are related to instruction, but the vast majority of them are. And in fact, there's several of these that are pretty specific to growth mindset. So this first one is just sort of a general idea. That's going to overlap some of what we've talked about today. How do you convey a growth mindset in a variety of contexts, and how do you think in that sort of manner? This next one is specific to syllabi. So you can take this for your own classes, and go side by side and be like, hey, what fixed mindset, types of framing or types of ideas, would I want to exclude, and what sort of growth mindset training might I want to include? And this provides actually a nice way for you to walk through your own syllabi with this lens in mind. The establishing expectations we've talked a little bit about already, this idea of how do I set those expectations and establish them. Again, given that you all have a good number of accredited programs, I think that's one way to do so is, hey, we're doing this in line with that accreditation, I'm talking about, students, hey, these might be high standards because, they want, actually yesterday I ran into someone wearing the University of Dubuque aviation shirt, we want that airplane to fly and stay in the air as long as it's supposed to and come back down. So yeah, there's going to be some high standards associated with that, and that's for the safety of everyone. This final one, looking specifically about how to offer feedback, and how to do so in a way that's, constructive, that's also received well by students. Because it could certainly be the case, if you look like I do, that students from minoritized backgrounds might not receive your feedback in a way that, is interpreted as, this is someone who really cares about me and who, wants me to do well. They might actually interpret that in a way, of bias on my part. And so how do you frame feedback in a way that, is good overall and that avoids that specific problem? So thank you all. That's all I have for today. And I would love to hear questions and talk some more. Yeah, absolutely. I think they're going to be.
Can I ask you to repeat the questions for the people in the room?
Oh, cool. Yes. Question was, are you going to have access to these resources? And the answer is yes. So that's why I have those hyperlinks in there, because when you get, I think you'll get a PDF of these. You can just click on all of those hyperlinks.
Bouncing back from academic setbacks is a life skill that can be applied to non-academic things. Do you have any insight into how people who have overcome major setbacks in their life, how that transfers to overcoming academic setbacks?
Yep. And so to repeat the question, this was about, the academic setbacks and thinking about this in the context of other life setbacks and overcoming those they might encounter. So this is actually one specific strategy if you're working with students that you can try to employ. So let's say, you have a student and they're clearly holding a fixed mindset about academic stuff. They're holding it strongly, and you're trying to engage with them, but you're like, oh, I could study more, but it's not really going to be worth it. So you're like, oh. So this is how you might be able to leverage it. Can you think about something? You ask the student, can you think about something in life that was difficult for you, but eventually you overcame it. And so hopefully they can think of one example of that. And so then ask them, okay, so what was it about, that situation? How did you overcome it? How did you use whatever you used to overcome it, and generalize this to the academic domain so that they can actually see, because potentially they're not necessarily within that other life domain that they're going to hold some sort of growth mindset or some idea, that they could use something to overcome. Even if that idea is just like, hey, this was just one test, that just didn't work out for me very well, and so maybe they're not going to think about everything differently, but at least maybe they'll be willing to study for that next test more effectively. I think that's one interesting strategy you can use, because again, as you mentioned, that people who hold a pretty fixed mindset in one domain may not do so in the other, and so how can you leverage the growth perceptions and try to move them into the academic domain as much as possible? Yeah.
Can you give an example of what you mean by fixed mindset in your syllabi?
Yeah, so some of it could be, as blatant as the example of the instructor in class. I think it's a little easier to talk about some of the growth framings, so to provide in there directly the sorts of resources that students can use. You could actually even state explicitly, some of this stuff about high expectations and overcoming it, so that already students, you're already normalizing challenge, and then say, providing resources in the syllabus of, sort of academic help on campus, or, encouraging them to come to you, saying so many students have found this to be a useful resource. I would only say that if it's true, but, that there are lots of things, I think more so on the growth mindset framing, a little less on the fixed. Some people argue as well that providing the and of course, this is work for you as an instructor, so take or leave this one idea, but the message of sending, hey, if you redo this assignment based on my feedback, I will give you a higher grade, or the difference between the two grades, halfway between or whatever, as a result of that is something that very explicitly conveys the growth mindset rather than, hey, this was a summative assessment, you took it, it's over. That resource probably provides a lot more and better illustrations there. Yeah.
I don't know if this is the same thing as growth or not, but redirection, is that an option? So a student has, and maybe it's my own fixed mindset, but the student is continuously failing despite, all the support and coming at it from different angles and different perspectives. Is there a way to help redirect them to help them grow in a different area?
To a different major?
Yeah, if a student gets ill every time they see blood, maybe nursing might not be for you. But still growing.
Yeah, I think so. And this is one of the things, and I think about this with academic probation as well, because I'm all about, my whole orientation is want students to succeed, want them to graduate, but if they're getting, F after F after F, semester after semester, at some point, it's going to be better for the student to their future debt, perhaps, just to, whether it's to move on, in this case, to another major or to move on elsewhere. Perhaps one way to think about that in a growth mindset lens is to think about, frame it as interest, hey, what are the things that you really enjoy? And then, if you sort of do it that way, so you're not necessarily saying, well, maybe this is you're not good enough for this, but actually, your example, so I'm diabetic, I've been diabetic for over 30 years, and I'm still afraid of needles. So I could not draw blood ever in my life. I mean, maybe I would get over it, eventually if I did enough practice or this or that. But that might be a good way to, even if it, in some ways there's, that they're not meeting academic standards, if you phrase that as interests, you can sort of avoid the, maybe you're not good enough, by some definition of that. And you can say like, hey, what's something you're really engaged and really excited about? What are the types of things you're excited about? And then can we help you find a major? Yeah.
I actually have more of a observation than a question. I'm the academic success coach here on campus, and I work with students who are on academic probation. And at the end of this semester, I always do a survey monkey just to see, what kind of suggestions they might have for me to, focus on for upcoming students.
Yeah.
And my statement is we've definitely transitioned from I need help time management and goal setting. Now the top thing is personal problems. So that mental health thing is really something that we all have to just keep in mind. It's beyond the growth mindset. It's really it paralyzes us sometimes with what's going on in the health side of it. So.
Absolutely. And I apologize. I realized I've been doing a bad job of repeating questions. So this question on observation here was around, the challenges with with mental health, particularly recently, is something that's heard most frequently in academic coaching contexts. And it's absolutely true. I mean, if you look at some of the stats, even before COVID, like the trend lines and just like how many students suffer like pretty substantial anxiety or stress or depressive symptoms. I mean, those numbers are like jaw-droppingly large, and they've only gotten worse. And so I think that's, an idea behind a lot of it, is like, why can't I succeed? Part of that is just like, I need to have the time and mental headspace to be able to engage in this as well. And I mean, so some of this can be useful in terms of maybe studying little bits, but, I think that that's something that's critical, and it can, and actually, in terms of like thinking about fixed mindset framing, it could be one of the things that's particularly dangerous about that. Because if you're thinking, if you're framing things in a fixed mindset message that students might hear, but that student is just struggling, to be able to like sit down and do readings and come to class and, kind of like, do the sorts of, general activities, not as a result of thinking they can do it or not, but then if you're sending these threatening messages like, oh, well, maybe you're not cut out for this, like, I wish I could say something more meaningful for how to deal with that. Yeah.
Something like, just an example, if you have like 5 assignments and you drop the lowest one, that type of strategy, is that growth mindset? Is that kind of sidestepping the issue?
Maybe it could be. How would you describe it as growth mindset?
I don't do it in my class, but I'm just kind of thinking of a scenario where I, as a student, maybe it's 5 quizzes or something like that, and the lowest scores you're on, for your grade.
It might actually be interesting. I think you could frame it that way, like as I've been thinking about it, and you could say like, for any number of reasons, like some student might not do well on a particular exam, whether that's because, something happened, that affected their mental health or just their ability, to spend time and effort around that. At the same time, it's important for you to understand all this material, particularly if it's an early course. It might be foundational to other coursework, or to create some material that students need to know. And so like in understanding that, here's one way in which we're supporting you. And so I think it might send at least as much of kind of mental health, although it's somewhat growth mindset as well. And you could even like probably add some explicit language around growth mindset, say something, along the lines of like, just because you don't do well on one exam doesn't mean, that you can't succeed, and we want this grade to be indicative of your sort of potential future success. And so this is my philosophy for why I do that. I think you would do that. Thank you. Okay. Also, I don't even think I repeated the question. The idea was, dropping like 1 out of, like 5 or however many quizzes, how do you frame those with mindset? Yeah.
Was it not too provocative, or I just wanted to enlarge the conversation a little bit. So the comment about, I can't stand this out of blood, maybe I should be a nurse. and maybe redirect them into something where there's a bit more potential for their mindset to grow. There's a larger conversation, and I know that our students are totally aware of it, about, maybe not everybody needs to go to college. Right? So we're having this conversation in the context that, well, people are already here, how can we get some of this mindset for college? But have you had anything to say about that general question? There are arguments that not everybody needs to emphasize it too much in society. So I'm just curious about your thoughts.
Yeah. So the question is basically, we've been talking about students in college, how do we think about, and sort of redirecting within college, but about going to college more broadly. This is where I might, do like a disciplinary punt and say that's like a question for the economists to deal with. Yeah, I think it is an interesting and important question. I mean, especially if we think, and there are people who study this and can provide a much better answer about, the labor force and what sort of materials are needed. I mean, I've heard critiques as well that, like, particularly pre-COVID, that there was just, hey, and particularly even maybe pre-COVID when the job market was tougher, employers could be really selective and require a college degree for maybe something that didn't require that training, and so that's, in a place where you could do that. And again, so much of my focus is students who are in college succeed. So I don't know that I have great things to say around that. But I think it is important to think about, what are the domains, So Robert Putnam argued that subjective well-being is the ultimate life outcome. If you do something, you're satisfied with your life, you're happy, you're not depressed, that's what we want for everyone. And so in some ways what this is, you could argue this presentation is sort of doing is like moving people in a direction where they can live these like sort of happy, fulfilling lives and careers, and so forth. And certainly that can happen outside of the realm of college. Making my money off college, I wouldn't recommend too many people to take, but I mean, it's a really interesting question.
So the premise of this really has been with the features you show that a growth mindset is something positive and a fixed mindset is generally something negative.
Yeah.
But I'm interested in how the same person might have fixed and growth in different domains. And I'm curious, like, is there ever any circumstance where a fixed mindset maybe isn't that bad, or it actually could have something positive to it?
I think the situation where it's not that bad is you haven't faced a major setback. So if you're that student, who's doing well and everything that's put in front of them, and whether it's a student or other things, hey, that looks great. I think at least personally, I'm not sure Phil Dweck would argue this specifically, but for me personally, like it's really like when growth mindset is important is when setbacks are encountered in people. You can struggle with this. I'm also not aware, though it might be out there, research showing sort of diversity of mindsets within people, so you can imagine that some people are going to be very consistent in their mindsets across, some people might have different types of mindset. That might have some interesting outcomes as well. The question being whether there are cases in which fixed mindset, may be adaptive or at least not bad. We might have time for one more.
I actually was going to piggyback onto Adam's question about, maybe it's more than just a 4-year degree at college. I think when I think of growth mindset, it's thinking about opportunity, being open-minded. So just being, having conversations with people about what are your interests, whether it's that 4-year, it's a 2-year, it's just, straight into the work field, that kind of thing. I mean, and I'm speaking somewhat from my experience. I work with exploring students, so students who are undecided. And so I get a lot of students who, their first year exploring, but sometimes they come to me as junior seniors, and they have no idea, they're just feeling lost and they're feeling unmotivated, that kind of thing. And so just having those conversations, I think, can be part of growth mindset, is just having a conversation, taking a step back, reflecting on, hey, I'm not maybe the happiest, or I was unsuccessful meeting the requirements, that kind of thing, and then just being open-minded, I think is part of the growth mindset too. So
absolutely. Yeah, so the comment being around growth mindset and, like sort of the open-mindedness and, in a variety of different contexts, which can also include 2-year colleges. I mean, obviously, it could include career as well, that you could go into your career, you can improve at your specific job. Maybe you want to move up into a higher position, you could hold different mindsets about the ability to do that, given that that might require a different skill set than what you currently possess you're going to be moving in something with a supervisory nature, where you're used to like doing, the actual sort of boots on the ground type of work there as well. Do you want to talk one more?
Would it be also helpful to talk about the whole notion of success in the academic environment? Students get fixated, I'm a C student, I'm a B student, I'm an A student, and sometimes even amongst colleagues will refer to them as, oh, this is an A student, this is a B student, this is a C student. And so that's the language that gets used to identify students and how students identify themselves within the paradigm of success. But if you sit down with a student and they may have a comment and they may say, oh, usually I get C's. Sometimes I take the conversation outside of that context and say, well, how have you developed as a person? How have you grown? How have you improved your study skills? Maybe this semester you started at a C at the beginning of the semester, you got a C+, but you did some kind of improvement in between to gain those particular skills. So would it be helpful to talk about the success paradigm and how the language shapes a fixed mindset within academia? Is that also an important part of the conversation?
Absolutely. So the question is, differentiating both students and faculty, referring to types of students in a fixed mindset way of C student, D student, A student, saying, okay, that's how they are. And I think could absolutely be the case, and that's one of those cases where you do want to challenge, well, hopefully, challenge ourselves to, I certainly, have, like how do we frame as all students as capable of success? And then if you hear students saying that, they would directly talk about, that. And I actually like this idea of using, their learning and, like don't focusing on the final grade, but focus on the process and what have they learned and how have they grown. And then, then using that as a way to reshape, their framing, this sort of self-identity, and like this overall letter.
Thank you so much. We're so happy to have you here. I have a couple things I can piggyback from him. He talked about his presentation being here, and it will be posted in the UD Teaching Center Moodle page. But give us a day or so to get all of them up there. And then keep going back, because presenters will be giving stuff, and we'll put things up on that page. The other thing is, he mentioned with the syllabi question about resources and Moodle and whatnot. Remember to explore the new forks and theme. The course blocks tab at the top. You and students can click on that and pull it down, and there are resources. They can make an appointment with their advisor, their first year advisor. They can make an appointment for a tutor. There's resources for the health center. There's all sorts of resources for students up there. And we'll be adding to that and cleaning that up a little bit for spring semester, just so you know that block doesn't change during the semester. So if you see something and you'd like added to that, let us know before spring semester classes get out. And you'll be back again in this room for a follow breakout session, and there's a couple other breakout sessions coming up. At lunch, if you read a summer read book, then there's a room there. If you are maybe like someone I know who maybe didn't quite make it through their book, I'm still going to go to my room and listen to the conversation and be there as well. Or maybe there's a book that you or something that you want to know about. I'm sure that nobody will mind if you hop in. But also, if you were not able to read a book this summer, our new faculty will be up in Stevens Hall for lunch, and you can meet and visit up there. So again, nice time for collaboration and visiting with your colleagues during lunch. I think that's all of the announcements we have. So move on to your next session. Thank you. Thank you so much.